Okay. Hey! I was actually thinking about bringing two vests and a different tie, so it looked like I did this on a different day, but then I forgot, and so I did. Okay. Today we are talking about the second half of this Tale of Two Cities, and that's Sparta and the war between Athens and Sparta. The more commonly used term to describe Spartans, it's actually not Sparta, it's Lacedaemoniae. And that's why on their shields there is a lambda or an L. But for our purposes, they're Spartans. Because that's what everybody knows them as. Sparta is a wildly different place than Athens. It couldn't actually be more different if they tried. Because Sparta is really a warrior factory. Spartan children, girls as well as boys, but the girls will shift off to a different path early on, are brought up in what's known as the agoge, A-G-O-G-E, which literally means the upbringing. But it's unlike any upbringing that you've ever seen before or will likely ever see again. Spartan infants are judged immediately upon birth for their viability. If the child seems sickly or underweight, then they kill it. And they just don't kill the baby. They take it to this cliff and they throw the baby off the cliff. They're not messing around. They don't need weak children messing up the works. So you could argue this is human sacrifice, but it's not for a god. It's for the efficacy of their army, for the ability of their army. If we can weed out the weak, the army will be stronger. We could also call this active eugenics. Eugenics is generally a term associated with the early 20th century and attempts to breed better humans, notably in the United States and in Nazi Germany, but practiced here 2,500 years ago in Sparta. So when you're 7 years old, the agoge begins. And it's kind of like a boarding school. But there are no trips to Iolata. There's no hypnotists that come in. There's no fun. This is the brutalest raising that any child could ever possibly imagine. Being a factory worker in 19th century Manchester at age 10, you could argue a little easier than being a Spartan child in the agoge. It starts at age 7. And you're taken away from your parents, and that's basically the end of that relationship. It lasts about 13 years of intense physical military training. At age 21, you become a full member of the army. You will be on active military duty for the next 4 decades. And at age 30, you become what's known as a similar, an equal. The similars do no work. They do not engage in commerce. Their job is to be warriors. They are the elite of Spartan society. The educational program of the agoge does actually have a literary side to it. Spartan children are taught to read and write. And in fact, notably, Spartan girls are taught to read and write. But it's very basic literacy. It's often said that, that conversations with a Spartan are neither long nor terribly interesting. Spartans are people of few words, both the men and the women. But in Athens, the girls don't get educated at all. So we've been talking about enlightened, democratic Athens, but it's enlightened and democratic if you're a man. If you're a woman in Athens, you have virtually no rights and are expected to be neither seen nor heard, and you're not going to be educated. Not the case here in Sparta, interestingly. So what we're going to watch now is a documentary clip that takes us through the agoge and life of one particular Spartan who actually will fight at the Battle of Thermopylae in 480 BC.
Upon entering a world, a Spartan infant was examined by the city's elders. If it was not healthy and sturdy, it would be flung into a ravine on Mount Aegatus and left to die. Surviving his first trial, Aristodemus was bathed not in water but wine to steel his constitution. Then he was handed over to a slave nurse. He would not be coddled. He was fed plain food and taught not to fear the dark or being alone. At 7, Aristodemus was enrolled in the state school, the Agoge. His life was now devoted to war.
Of reading and writing, they learned only enough to serve their turn. All the rest of their training was calculated to make them obey commands well, endure hardships, and conquer in battle.
The young Aristodemus was forbidden underclothes and shoes. Instead, he received a single cloak to last the whole year. During exercise, he went barefoot and naked. He was given no bed. He had to make his own from coarse rushes, plucked and twisted by hand. His diet was deliberately poor. To supplement it, he was encouraged to steal food, for someday his life might depend on living off the land. But if caught, he was beaten, first by the owner he had stolen from, then by his tutor for getting caught. At 12, Aristodemus began training with weapons: the sword, the thrusting spear, and the bulwark of the Spartan army, the shield. It was a simple metal disc hammered over a wooden core. The warrior passed his left arm through a loop to a grip on the rim. A line of soldiers so protected formed a phalanx, a wall of shields, where the right side of each man was protected by the shield of the man beside him. So important was it that warriors were told to come back with their shields or on them. At 20, Aristodemus faced another rite of passage: the privilege of joining a mess.
The messmates contributed monthly a bushel of barley meal, 8 gallons of wine, 5 pounds of cheese, 2.5 pounds of figs, and a very small amount of money for such relishes as flesh and fish.
For a Spartan warrior, belonging to a mess was not only a symbol of status, it was status itself. A man without a mess was like a soldier without an army. Still, the mess itself was as austere as the Spartans.
When they're talking about a mess here, M-E-S-S, you might think, that word makes no sense. The military term. The equivalent would be something like a platoon or a company or a regiment. It's a small group of warriors that basically live together, eat together, and do lots of other things together. So that's what a mess is here.
A visiting foreigner thought the food so bad that he is said to have remarked, "Now I know why the Spartans do not fear death." In the mess and the barracks, bonds were forged that could not be broken on the battlefield. Training together, eating together, sleeping together, comrades became friends and lovers. No greater glory could a man seek than to die in battle for the one he loved.
Spartan society in particular, and Greek society in general, is extraordinarily, we call homosocial. The women were kind of an afterthought. The training that you received, you had a mentor in the Spartan army during your teenage years here. And that relationship often became, let's be honest, sexual. and relationships between the men, between the similars, often became sexual. And that's just the nature of this society. It's a society in which women play a very small role. A Spartan woman's main job is to produce Spartan warriors. That's about it. It's still an extraordinarily male-centric, patriarchal society in Spartan or in Athens.
Aristodemus could now also take a wife, but marriage would not change his routine.
After supping at his public mess table as usual, he slipped stealthily into the room where his bride lay, loosed her virgin's robe, and bore her in his arms to the marriage bed. Then, after spending a short time with his bride, he went away to his usual quarters, there to sleep alongside the other young men.
Only at age 30 did Aristodemus reach the last stage of Spartan education. He was now an equal. For the rest of his life, an equal devoted himself to affairs of state and the art of war. He could choose to live with his family if he had one, but he could not farm or trade. Such work was left to others. The result, an army that could outdrill, outmarch, and outfight any other.
So this system, the agoge, is very successful at producing the best warriors in the world. It's a system and an ideology that has, over the centuries, been widely lauded by many people in various places. And reenactors, LARPers, live-action role players, often enjoy dressing up as Spartans. I love this guy here. So these are catcher's shin guards from baseball. This is obviously plastic. I'm guessing these shields are made from this type of sled that's a circle used to sled down snowy hills. I also like that this guy has jeans and tennis shoes on. Oh, God bless you, reenactors. You never fail to amuse me. So it's these two states, Sparta and Athens, that are the two superpowers of Greece in the decades after the Peloponnesian War, after the Persian Wars, excuse me. And it's these two states that will engage in a massive war that will last an entire generation, the last 3 decades of the 5th century. The Peloponnesian War, so named because the peninsula on which you find Sparta is known as the Peloponnesus, and so this is the Peloponnesian War. Lasts over 25 years. Small break in the middle in the 4-teens, like between about 418 and 416. But basically an epic struggle between these two superpowers. So we look at a map, and you have this map as a handout. You can see how the sides lined up. Blue is Athens, mainly members of the old Delian League. Red is Sparta and its allies, and yellow are neutral parties. So Thessaly, Epirus. This is Macedonia up here that we will meet on Monday. This is where Alexander the Great comes from. And this is a war that's not started by the militaristic Spartans. No, 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 no. This is a war that started by the Athenians, and in particular by Pericles.
One day in the year 431 BC, Pericles took the podium and presented the Athenians with a bold new plan. A proposal that would offer Athens her final crowning glory. Pericles intended to vanquish Athens' last great rival, the city-state of Sparta. Sparta was the only other Greek state that matched Athens' power. The Spartans ruled all of southern Greece, and they were a fearsome military force. Their citizens were trained from birth in the arts of war. Tension had been building between Athens and Sparta for decades. For Pericles, it was now time to take on this dangerous adversary. To make Athens the undisputed leader of the Mediterranean.
If we go to war, as I think we must, be determined that we are not going to climb down. For it is from the greatest dangers that the greatest glory is to be won.
The assembly embraced Pericles' plan. The Athenians were never ones to shrink from a fight.
The ancient Greeks as a whole were not by any stretch of the imagination a peace-loving people. Peace was an interruption of war rather than vice versa, and the Athenians were as bellicose as any other Greeks.
So this is a war that started by Athens. In general, and Pericles in particular. The year is 431. The Parthenon has just been completed. He believes that Athens can win this war and become the single dominant power in the entire Greek world. His assumption will turn out to be wrong.
But Pericles knew that any war with Sparta would not be easy to win. For the Spartan infantry were far superior to Athens' forces. Athens' strength lay in her navy. So Pericles proposed a strategy of astonishing complexity and sophistication. He convinced the Athenians to abandon all the land around Athens and retreat behind the great long walls that stretched down from the city to its harbour at Piraeus. Pericles would supply the city by sea. Merchantmen would bring in grain, wheat and other essential supplies from Athens' colonies and allies across the Mediterranean. Protected by the mighty Athenian fleet. And Pericles would use this great navy to attack the Spartans from the coast. It was a strategy based on a set of finely judged assumptions.
Pericles' expectation was that after a year or two, but no more than 3, the Spartans would realize that they could not win the war because the Athenians would never give them the infantry battle they needed in order to win, and they had no other device available.
Athens' fleet had always been key to the city's success. It had won the city great military victories, and it had built her an empire. Pericles was sure that this fleet could now bring Athens her greatest triumph. The Athenians crowded behind the city walls. Confident in their vision of imperial power and glory, they assumed that Pericles' strategy could only bring them victory. The Spartans invaded Athenian territory and set about burning all the farmland around the city. The Athenians became increasingly anxious. They could only watch from the city walls as their fields and crops were destroyed. But such was Pericles' reputation, he managed to convince the Athenians to stick with his plan. The city could rely on her fleet and shipments from overseas to survive. Little did Pericles know that this fleet now carried an even greater threat. One year into the war, the grain boats that fed the city brought with them an additional cargo: plague. A disease that would now devastate Athens.
Pericles' plan couldn't anticipate difficulties that we now would suggest were rather likely in those circumstances of crowding. And the results were horrendous.
With the population crammed behind the city walls, the affliction spread like wildfire. The symptoms were horrific. The Athenian historian Thucydides, who lived through these years, recorded its effects.
The body was suddenly seized, first with violent heats around the head and redness and inflammation of the eyes, and then the disease descended into the bowels, producing violent ulceration and uncontrollable diarrhea. The sufferings of individuals seemed almost beyond the capacity of human nature.
The city must have looked terrible, smelled terrible, been awful to be in, and terror must have reigned everywhere.
Sufferers, racked with fever and overcome with unquenchable thirst, would crawl into the city systems and water mains to die. Thucydides witnessed the scene in Athens streets.
The bodies of dying men lay one upon another, and half-dead creatures reeled about the streets. The catastrophe became so overwhelming that men cared nothing for any rule of religion or law.
The plague's effects on Athens were absolutely devastating. The whole fabric of Athenian society broke down. Morally, people saw no point in being good. Why be good if the good and the evil die just as easily?
The plague would kill over a third of Athens' population. And then it struck the city's figurehead, Pericles. Plutarch, Pericles' biographer, described his symptoms.
The plague seized Pericles, not with sharp and violent fits, but with a dull and lingering distemper, wasting the strength of his body and undermining his immortal soul.
By the end, the patrician hero of the city was reduced to relying on potions and magic in an attempt to cure himself.
He showed one of his friends a charm that a woman had hung around his neck, as if to say that he was very sick indeed when he would admit of such foolery as this.
Finally, after 6 months of lingering illness, Pericles died in 429 BC. Pericles had planned to make Athens into the Mediterranean's greatest power. But his carefully calculated strategy had brought only disease and death.
Like most brilliant men, like most people who have had great success all their lives, Pericles simply underestimated the degree to which some things are out of the control of the very best intelligence and the very best knowledge that there are.
The war doesn't end with Pericles' death. The war drags on for decades. Sparta, dominant on the land. Athens, still dominant on the seas. Yes, 50% of the population died in the plague, but that means there's 50% fewer mouths to feed. However, in 416 BC, the Athenians make a tragic miscalculation. They will send their entire fleet to Sicily, which is actually right about here, in an attempt to conquer Sicily, which is full of Greeks who have been there since the 700s BC, and to secure the rich farmlands of Sicily and to make it a game changer in this war against Sparta. It doesn't work. It is a catastrophe. Let's see what happens. Hang on a second. I get it.
Then in the year 416 BC, a daring proposal was put before the assembly. A proposal which, even if it did not defeat the Spartans, would at least satisfy Athens' hunger for glory. A small Greek colony on the island of Sicily had asked for protection. Protection from a neighbor allied with Sparta. Why should the Athenians not come to their aid, humiliate their Spartan adversary, and perhaps conquer all of Sicily at the same time? As one Athenian addressed the assembly,
"This is the way we won our empire, and this is the way all empires have been won. Let us set out on this expedition, for it will destroy the arrogance of the Spartans, and at the same time we shall become rulers of all Greece."
it was a bold plan to be executed on a vast scale, requiring a great fleet of warships and a landing force of over 10,000 men. The Athenians threw themselves into the project with fervor. Armorers beat out new weapons. Soldiers tested out their equipment. Stores were loaded onto a fleet of Athenian triremes. And the shipwrights prepared their vessels for the sea. Then, to great fanfare, the mighty invasion force set out for Sicily. 6 months later, word came back. The campaign was not going as quickly as hoped. They needed reinforcements. And then, nothing. No news at all.
Then, in the autumn of 413 BC, a sailor arrived in the city. A man who needed a haircut. And as he talked to his barber, he told an appalling tale of a vast and terrible slaughter. It was the story of an invading army that had been pinned down where it landed, of how its leaders had argued with each other about strategy, of how their food and water had run out, of how they'd attempted to ford a great river in a desperate attempt to escape.
They rushed into it, all discipline lost, and every man wanting to cross first. They fell over each other and trod each other underfoot, and they drank thirstily. The water was foul, but still they went on drinking, mud, blood and all, the dead lying thick in the riverbed.
This was how the Athenians discovered that they had been the victims of one of the greatest defeats in ancient history. Over 50,000 men had been killed or taken prisoner. 2 entire fleets of Athens' prized triremes had been destroyed.
The Sicilian campaign is a mess for a variety of reasons. First of all, it's a long way away. It's over 600 or 700 miles. Once they arrive, they squabble and fight about what to do. But perhaps the biggest problem is there's not a tactical reason to do it. There's not a strategic reason to do it. The motivation is highly self-interested.
The Athenians, entranced by a vision of imperial glory, had in fact engaged in a pointless and vain campaign.
They believed that wrongly they could go quickly in, raise the countryside, and win a quick victory and a rich tributary subject state.
Thucydides recorded the scale of the devastation.
This was the most notorious action that we know of in Greek history, for they were absolutely, calamitously defeated. The losses were total. Army, navy, everything was destroyed.
With Athens' military power now crippled, her enemies began to close in. The Persians, whom the Athenians had humiliated 50 years before, now saw the ideal opportunity for revenge. They approached the Spartans with the offer of help.
The Persians have been watching this carefully, and they decide to intervene and subsidize the Spartans, and that subsidy is in the form of manpower for rowing and fleet construction.
Where previously the Spartans had never been a naval nation, now they had a fleet paid for with Persian gold. With Athens' navy decimated by the defeat in Sicily, the Spartans could now blockade the Athenian harbors. The great grain convoys from Egypt and the colonies could no longer get through. And finally, the Athenians began to starve in the streets. The people turned to their patron goddess, Athena. At the height of Athens' glory, only 30 years before, Heracles had honored her with the most glorious temple ever seen. But the goddess could offer no help now. Athens, once so sure of her preeminence in the Greek world, was now home to a population ravaged by plague and war, besieged and starving. With her treasuries empty and her once proud fleet crippled. In 404 BC, Athens finally surrendered to the Spartan commander, Lysander. The Spartans' terms were heavy. The great walls which had defended the city were to be torn down. Her fleet was to be destroyed.
We had this wonderful scene of Lysander sailing into the Piraeus and dismantling the Athenian fleet. That's important because the destruction is symbolically a destruction of the Athenian Empire.
What remained of Athens' mighty navy was put to the torch, with only 12 ships allowed to remain. No longer would she rule the Mediterranean.
The Athenians became convinced that they could do, finally, in the end, more than they really could. And I think this is really the point in which the potential that Athenian democracy brought about could turn to tragedy. They could achieve great things, they could not achieve all great things.
So, this war lasts for more than 25 years, and we'll see the destruction of the preeminent naval power in the Mediterranean, Athens. I want to end with a playwright who's born at the height of Periclean power and who lives through the Peloponnesian Wars. His name is Aristophanes. One of the results of the open society you have in Athens is the potential to criticize the government in a way that you don't really have elsewhere, and you won't really have again in a meaningful way until England in the 17th and 18th centuries and its American colonies after that. And he writes two anti-war plays during the Peloponnesian War. The first is called The Acarnanians, written about 425 BC, and it's about a single Athenian citizen who decides to make a separate peace with the Spartans. And all the benefits that come from that peace treaty he signs personally. Widely regarded as the world's first anti-war piece of theater, literature, what have you. But it's tame in comparison to a play he will write towards the end of the Peloponnesian War, after the disastrous Sicilian campaign, a play called the Lysistrata. In it, the main character, Lysistrata, convinces her fellow Athenian women to withhold sex from the Athenian men in order to end the war. And the Athenian women band together with the Spartan women, and they all agree to go on a sex strike to attempt to end this destructive war that their men have been fighting now at this point for over 20 years. Defeat in the war will not result, though, in the destruction of the Athenian cultural revolution that's going on. After all, 20 years after the end of the war is when Plato will found the Academy and will write all of his Socratic dialogues. Now, the war will take the life of Socrates in 399 as a kind of scapegoat for what went wrong, but the intellectual ferment that begins in the decades after the Persian Wars will not be destroyed by the Peloponnesian War, and that's quite significant for future art and science and culture. And this is something that we'll talk about more on Monday in regards to the vast Greek world opened up by the conquest of a non-Greek from Macedon, Alexander the Great. So, on Monday, we're down here. The calendar on the website is still accurate. We will be talking about Alexander the Great. You've got pages 142 to 149 in the textbook, and you have two pieces of primary source evidence, neither significantly written from the time that Alexander's alive. We have virtually nothing written from his contemporaries. These are written by later Roman authors, Plutarch and Arrian, about Alexander the person and Alexander military campaigns. So on Monday, we'll talk a little bit about the military conquest of Alexander, but we'll mainly talk about the kind of intellectual explosion that happens in the 4th century in the Greek-speaking world, which will encompass the entire Eastern Mediterranean, and how Greek becomes the lingua franca, the international language of the Eastern Mediterranean, right up through the Middle Ages. So, page 142, 149, the Anabasis of Alexander by Arrian, and the Life of Alexander by Plutarch.